I'd like to welcome back 5 of our speakers from earlier today. Ted Baillieu, Trevor Pisciotta, Vit Garnis, Jeanette Barbaro, and online we've also got Lydia Morawska. Jeanette is graciously going to facilitate today's panel, where we'll try and pick up on some of the themes discussed this morning. Over to you, Jeanette.
Thank you very much, Ben. Now, this is an opportunity for you to ask questions. Please send your questions through, and I encourage you to do so, if for no other reason than to stop me, a lawyer, taking control of all the question asking, because we love to ask questions, as you all very well know. So I'd like to start with a general question that is interesting from both a technical perspective but also from a public policy perspective. And that is reform to introduce different standards to manage and help manage air quality control realistic, having regard to the fact that there are so many building spaces that we live, work and play in, having regard to how different they are, and having regard to the fact that how they're used each day can change. So is it realistic to set an air quality standard? Lydia, can we start with you?
I'm very happy to start. Well, what I've mentioned, and actually I was very pleased to see something very similar in one of your slides in relation to indoor air standards. What I've stated is we need performance standards. So not only design standards, but performance standards. This is how it operates in relation to outdoor air. So we don't only have regulations about controlling individual sources, individual industries and so on, but it's performance. We measure specific parameters, and if the parameters are according to the prescribed levels, it's fine. If not, we do something. We can do something like this in indoor environment, and CO2 is the best example that it's possible and achievable and done. Actually, it was actually in one of the TED slides, I think, from Belgium, showing this display in an event in Belgium. But it sounds like a very noble concept to us now, but I've seen something like this in Germany years ago. And this was used, the display of CO2 monitors in schools, and this was informing teachers and children what to do. So this is achievable. CO2 is the first example of this, but there could be other parameters. As I said, not all of the air pollutants will be immediately measured indoors. It's still technologically too difficult, but we can measure some other proxies, which would be performance standards.
And that sounds to me like it's something that needs constant monitoring, because what is happening in a space may change, let alone the space itself. So from a public policy perspective, is such a standard something that can actually be introduced and imposed on consumers, retailers and industry?
Well, if I might, Jeanette, I think it can, and governments own a lot of buildings. Governments own a lot of indoor spaces and they have responsibility for the use of those spaces, and they can take a lead in that regard. And the sort of measures that Trevor's been talking about this morning I think are important. But normalising for the next generation is just as important. It's interesting to watch what's been going on in some US states. A couple of professors there have come up with what they call the Corsi-Rosenthal box, and Lydia might have different views about this, but it's 2 professors who designed a box that kids can assemble at schools, and it works to a reasonable degree as I understand it. But part of that process is educating kids. But we have to normalise. We have to normalise the consideration of air quality. So when you go into a space, it's not just how hot or cold it is, it's whether it's clean air. And in terms of regulation, we have a lot of very sophisticated high-rise, high-density buildings, but they're nowhere near as sophisticated in regulation, maintenance, management and monitoring as aircraft or as shipping. And the question is, why not? They're just as critical. And if we can do it for those industries, we should be able to do it for certainly those high-grade buildings. And I think the sooner we normalise that, the better.
Trevor?
Yeah, thanks, Jeanette. So I think there's no doubt we can do it if there's will, and if the technology exists. I think the challenge that always occurs when you're trying to improve standards is the legacy issue. So it's one thing to say we require new buildings to perform to a certain standard. I think that's the relatively easier side of it. The harder one is imposing it on existing building stock in the knowledge of what that might require in terms of upgrades to systems. And to the point that you made, I think, Jeanette, in your presentation, knowing where those costs will fall. So that, I think, is the bigger challenge. And obviously, the majority of the spaces we occupy are going to be spaces that are already built. A small subsection of ones yet to be built, and that will change over time. But I think raising the standards for existing building stock, is both technically and from a public policy point of view, I think the harder ask. That's not to say it's impossible, but I think it is the more challenging space to move into.
Just quickly, if I can go back, we go back 20 years and look at disability access. And when those concepts to prepare new standards for disability access were prepared, there was a lot of resistance from those who managed and owned existing buildings. It's now very much normal, and it's allowed adjustment of existing stock and turnover of stock as well. So I think we've got the precedents. What we're missing is the will at the moment, because it's just a bit harder to see.
Vit, did you want to copy in on this?
I like handling complex problems and providing simple answers. I'm sorry to say this, but the answer is exceptionally simple. When we had an energy crisis and we had to regulate our buildings for energy, how did we institute the BEAC program? We turned to NABERS, we adopted the NABERS energy module, and we regulated our buildings, and we've now got a very good portfolio of energy efficiency. NABERS has 10 years of indoor environment data on major buildings around the country. If we adopted the NABERS IE module, plug it into regulations as well as standards if necessary, you could do it in a week. It is just so deceptively simple that it makes me cry to see how people are making it complex. We have baseline. Most of major industry have adopted those baselines. They know whether they're 5, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1 star. On IEQ, not as many of them for energy, because the national regulations on energy have forced realtors, people who run buildings, down that energy path, as well as internal competition between buildings. Let's do it. Let's just plug NABERS IE with 10 years of background information. It is a very mature product, and we'd be first in the world to do it, and it'd be exceptionally, I just don't know why we're making it so complex. And sorry, one more thing. When we tried to introduce or implement indoor environment quality in buildings, the only regulatory tool we have is occupational health and safety. Occupational health and safety is for spray booths. It's not for environmental health. Environmental health is a totally different set of standards. NABERS IE have environmental health, so it's not the hygienists, occupational hygienists who work in the industrial space. It's actually the environmental health specialists who need to understand this. NABERS IE has adopted this principle. We know that it's a 24-hour exposure limit, not an 8-hour exposure limit we need to be talking about. Those experts in the audience will know what I'm talking about. So let's just plug in NABERS IE, all the country adopt it, and it's not problem solved. This is the start of the data-driven performance rather than design, and that'll feed back into design, obviously, to achieve those requirements that are necessary. So I'm sorry to say this, but we seem to be mired down with the complexity of it. Those of us that have been in this industry for a long time and followed this for a decade know how simple it is, and the will has not been there, even though the federal government owns NABERS.
I wouldn't disagree with a thing you said, Vit, save for. If you ask the general public what NABERS was, they'd say it's a drama series on television rather than environmental standard for buildings, or standard process. We have a communication issue that we have to get through on this.
Well, imagine now the British Parliament is adopting Neighbours, the challenge to try to tell them that it's not a TV program.
That may be a harder challenge.
No,
Lead this
Ted,
equality.
we need you, Ted, because when I said Neighbours to you a number of years ago, you said not Neighbours, it's Nabbers.
Yeah, well,
do you remember that statement?
I do. I wasn't going to raise that, but
and maybe we'd call it something different.
I've always used Nabbers rather than Nabbers.
That's right.
When I accepted this role, I always knew that I was going to be challenging, moderating you all. But let's continue, because I think you've raised an interesting issue, and it's tied in a way to costs. I understand the concept and the simplicity of what you're saying, but ultimately at the end of the day, there is a struggle, is there not, between efficiency and energy saving and ultimate costs. And for mum and dad, that's an issue. For our big property building holders, that's a massive issue. So how do we find a sweet spot where we achieve the standard that's required but not compromise on energy efficiencies?
Am I allowed to speak first after that?
Absolutely.
How much does it cost to run a high-rise building? That's a few $1 million a year. You're talking about $2,000 or $3,000 to do a neighbours assessment. That's the start of the process if you're inadequate, because then you have to have the capital expenditure, etc., the filtration and so on necessary to do it. But at least you know where you stand, and you can plan your expenditure accordingly, that before your next assessment in a year or two, so you can expend that. But it is, we have building owners who complain about $2,000 and they're losing energy on tens of thousands of dollars a day. So it's not an issue, it is a confected issue that it's expensive.
So it's interesting coming
I
back.
think Rob Adams is going to tell us a bit more about that tomorrow in the remarkable Council House 2 project.
Yeah.
But I mentioned in my presentation, I agree with Vet, that those early things are all about getting in some understanding for people whether the air they're breathing is a problem. If they don't know, they can't do anything about it, and they won't do anything about it.
So that's a
But
great.
if they know there's a problem, then a force will address it.
And that may get people's attention to do something, because we'll come to that question in a moment. But much like combustible cladding, Trevor and Ted, the solution that's been proposed allows for identification. Lydia has spoken about what you then do when you've identified, and I just want to come back to that because it relates to some of the questions that I can see coming through. Partly, to an extent, if a building has a ventilation issue and there is a capital expenditure needed for an existing building to improve it, the building owner will take care of that if they can afford to do so. If it's a residential building, more complicated, because often the ventilation system is common property, and then we are square back to combustible cladding. So having used the tool to identify and having found that, for example, high-rise residential buildings are particularly problematic, we then face the same issue in this state, and probably Australia-wide, as to who should pay to make the necessary adjustments that are needed. That's the first part. The second part, from what I understood you saying, Lydia, was that there's a behavioural change that we are each empowered to take on. We can look in our schoolroom to monitors to understand what the care quality is. But what happens once you identify there's a problem? So 2 questions there for you all. I'm happy for anyone to take the first.
I can start. Actually, there are probably more than 2 questions in what you said. This business, who should do it? And actually going back to what we were saying about retrofitting, I've heard many times that there's an issue. Okay, we could we have a problem, but if we propose any standards, who will pay for retrofitting all the existing building? And this sounds like, okay, we can't do anything because this would be so costly. But the point is that regulations, and one of my colleagues already mentioned, regulations never start immediately. So it's not that from tomorrow or next week, all the buildings will have to be retrofitted. And there are many, many examples of this, that regulations came, and it was only years after when they had full effect on everything. I often go back to what happened with regulations for clean water in England when initially they came. It took about 20 years before clean water was in fact in all the buildings. So if we put some timelines on this, so this becomes more manageable. We are not going to resolve this complex problem immediately. So this is one aspect. I think you mentioned also that awareness education. This is so absolutely critical because air, even polluted air, is not visible. And again, was it Ted or Trevor mentioned this? It's not visible. We don't see this. It's not a problem. And also we have this unhealthy relationship with the pollution sources. I'm not talking now necessarily about the infection, but all the combustion sources, our cars, well, they are our best friends, and many other combustion sources. So on one hand, there's pollution. On the other hand, there are our enemies. So awareness that there's a problem is one of the critical aspects. And it's not that difficult to I don't think you can see this reflections, my CO2 meter. It is in my handbag, and I took it to many groups, and it was, wow, that's how simple it is. Oh, that's how a problem it is. Actually, I've done this with some politicians here in Brisbane during the meetings, and it was, wow, where is it coming from? I didn't think it would be that high. So this is really the starting point at education. And once it's identified as a problem, sometimes the solution is simple, sometimes not. And also that cost, who pays? Who pays for this? The easiest is to calculate that initial investment cost or the cost of retrofitting. But the cost of building-related illnesses, infections, or any other problems with indoor air quality, absenteeism, lack of cognitive performance, and so on, this is not counted. And the cost of this, when it is counted, are much, much higher than the initial investment cost. So, sorry, try to answer too many questions at a time.
Yes,
yeah, thanks. I think Lydia's absolutely right. The way you tackle this, we're talking too much.
Trevor's just gone off on my monitor there, Lydia. He's triggered 3,000 parts per million just for a couple of state government sentences.
The way we get there, I think, you're absolutely right. You know, you start by don't make the problem worse, right? So if we know we've got a problem with air quality and ventilation, you develop standards that require all new buildings to meet those standards. So straight away you've stopped the problem getting worse. And then you map out a reasonable pathway over time to bring the rest of the building stock up to the standard. And you know, there may be various support that, you know, governments at various levels might lean into that. There's different ways to bring them on that journey. And I think as soon as you were speaking, Lydia, about quantifying the costs of poor air quality, my mind was straight away going to regulatory impact statements. The way in government we do this work of thinking about the cost-benefit analysis of, you know, here are the costs of doing it, and the costs fall on these individuals over a period of time. But what are the costs of inaction, and weighing those against each other to find a kind of optimal pathway forward for that regulatory change. So I do think that's a pathway that's achievable, and it's just about what realistic timelines might be across the entire building stock.
Vit, did you want to chime in before we move on?
Yeah, there's a lot of answers to these questions. When I'm lost, I travel a fair bit, and when I'm lost in a major city, I ask for someone who knows the local landmarks, a policeman or a local resident or so on. So in other words, a local expert and a consultant. The path to this, we're the world record holders with our transition to efficient energy use of buildings, because we've had a tool, we've adopted that tool nationally, and we've all moved through it. We have, in terms of the timelines, just to address the timelines, we could transition to a good IEQ scenario for buildings in the NABERS model. The NABERS model is progressive improvement. If you're a 1-star building, to go to 2 stars is a big progress. Next year you go to 3, then you go to 4, and you're showing improvement. So it's the rate of improvement as well as the achievement. Not everyone's going to be 6 stars, nor should they be, but they can progress to it. So that's deferred capital expenditure. So we don't have to go to 6 stars in one jump. And that's important to know with the age of our buildings and the requirements.
And I want to know whether your building is 1 star or 2 star or more, and I don't really want to go into a 1-star building.
Well, that's another issue, and I've designed certificates for Indian buildings where when they go into a building, into a hotel, they know they're a 1, 2 or 3 star for the buildings that we have monitored in India. So I've always advocated hotels in particular should have a star rating on indoor environment as well as all the other occupancy type standards that they might hold. On the issues of expertise, I think Australia is quite unique because we have a small population, obviously separated, but the separation is at different climates all at once. So we can do from a tropical to a Tasmanian, from north to south, etc. So we've got all those in a very compact model to be able to compare those and apply them around the world. So I feel that there's both a world and a federal government responsibility to look at Australia as possibly a technically advanced nation that has an interest in this. It values its population, values its through its OH&S and environmental regulations to be able to translate and put some effort into realising that 90% of our people work in buildings and 90% of the cost of running our buildings is labour cost. We need to, and our knowledge is based on our cognition. If the indoor environment is no good, we need a pandemic, obviously, to have a disaster. How did we solve the Legionella issue? It wasn't the Melbourne Aquarium or the Wesley Hospital, both of which projects we worked on. It was then the rapid translation. Melbourne Aquarium took the state government how long, Ted? Less than a month to come up with Legionella regulations for cooling towers. It took the Wesley Hospital in Queensland. The Queensland government took roughly about a month or 2 to institute a regulation for drinking water guidelines for Legionella. We can do it.
Have we lost the opportunity?
I was reminded the other day, Jeanette, that once upon a time when water was generally dirty, the solution was wine.
Still is.
That may still be the case. But I want to come back to what you've just said, because I'm concerned that perhaps we've missed the opportunity. We've lived with COVID for the last 2 years, and the messaging, and I'm not suggesting this is not rightly so, the messaging at the moment is, here in Victoria, for example, the most locked down state in the world, we can go back to work as of the 1st of March. We don't have to wear masks. We can resume a normal lifestyle. We can go to the footy as soon as the season starts and have full capacity at the MCG. All of that messaging is what we need, but at the same time suggests that the problem is sorted. And in that context, how difficult is it going to be to get an uptake of the amazing work that your team, Trevor, has been doing with the guidelines to get people to look at the ventilation issue in the spaces that they are either commanding or using?
So I think that's a really... Sorry.
We'll start with Trevor and I'll come back to you next, Lydia.
Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, Jeanette. Obviously that is a challenge, and there's the balance, I think, between, Ted talked about the need to get people back into offices, to get people back into the CBD, to reactivate the economy, to restore a sense of confidence. And I think that all is really critical and is clearly driving, I think, some thinking across different governments. But equally, I think one of the things I think we can collectively do is that education piece, drawing the link between good ventilation, improved ventilation, and better outcomes in terms of COVID transmission. Because COVID transmission is going to continue. I don't think anyone's pretending it is going away. We're at a level of vaccination and a level of infection where it's considered appropriate to remove those restrictions, but there's still COVID transmission. And people don't like getting sick. They don't like being isolated at home for 7 days. They certainly don't like the extreme impacts it can have on the most vulnerable of the community. So I think there's a really strong role for education in driving some of the uptake of some of the mitigations, and certainly so far in our engagement with industry, when we go out and talk to business owners, they want to know what they can do to keep their staff and their customers safe. They don't want to be losing staff and cafes that have to close for a week because they don't have enough staff to run, or other businesses, they don't want to be in that situation. And if there's pretty low cost things they can do that reduce that risk by improving ventilation, I think they're keen to know what they are. So it's really, at this point, I think education and information will go a long way. Will it get us all the way to good air quality? No, I don't think it will, and that's where the case for regulation comes in. But I think regardless, notwithstanding the changes that we're seeing, I think we're still enough in the middle of this thing to kind of drive behaviour change, is my sense.
Lydia?
Well, there are times and days when I think the situation is pretty hopeless, that nothing's going to change, listening to nonsensical new regulations which have nothing to do with science. There was actually a question to that extent at the end of the morning panel by Norman. So what are we going to do for things to change? But being here on this panel now in this session, I can say that things have actually immensely changed. The fact that there are 5 of us here and speaking the same voice. So it's not that Vit and I, who have known each other for, again, too many years to count them, and we've been working on these things and we understood the importance of this. But a panel like this wouldn't have happened 2 years ago. We wouldn't be together in the same room. It was my dream to have a lawyer being interested in this. It would have been a dream to have politicians involved in this. And now we 5 of us are speaking the same voice. And not only we are speaking, but there are actions being taken. Now, Victoria, I've been always giving this Victoria as the best example in the country where things are actually happening compared to other states. So things are happening. So it is action. So the only point is that we cannot stop now. And also, a very important aspect is to elevate this to national level. Because if we have different regulations in this respect in different states, the confusion mess will continue. What I've been pointing out and trying to in my article in the conversation last year, and my attempts to discuss this with the federal ministers, we really need national level approach to this. So with Victoria leading this, I'm now hopeful that things will improve.
Well, Lydia, you're preaching to the converted when it comes to the desire for national solutions, not just for air quality, but building regulation per se. There are a number of questions that are coming in, and they're all very different. So I'm just going to pose them. And if you'd like to tackle them, please do so. So the first is one that seems to has got a lot of tension, and it's this. We need baseline data to build standards and regulation, but with failing tests and cluster tracking, we seem to be losing the opportunity to gather case studies of good and bad practice. How can we get in the habit of learning from experience?
Yeah, well, unbiased measure, but getting those measurements, getting access, both in the public and the government and the private realms, including schools with 4 classrooms, is very difficult. So, how to do that, how interventionists, we don't have interventionist governments. We're not like the Chinese government who welds the doors shut and you can't leave your building. We have voluntary laws, so I think that's going to be a very difficult one to get the data to justify the action.
A quick one from me. As I understand it, Melbourne City Council have done a fair bit of research on hesitation about using public transport, hesitation about coming back to the city, hesitation about cafes and restaurants. And whilst that sounds very subjective, it is real in terms of if we don't make buildings and indoor spaces safe, people will stay away. Mm-hmm. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge for everybody. And at the moment, we're kidding ourselves that restaurants and cafes are coming back. But if you walk around, look at the restaurants, everyone's eating outside. When it starts to get cold and it starts to get wet, there's going to be that same challenge again. And we haven't used these last few months as we should have to provide the means for those businesses to do the measuring they need to overcome what's down the track.
I agree with everything Ted just said, and I think it'll be really interesting over the next few months to see what happens in terms of the return of office workers, particularly in the CBD, and the level of reluctance. I think we saw some of it last year, but the return wasn't there for long enough to really assess how much concerns around ventilation were driving behaviour. But certainly, I know we get questions, as someone who has staff that report to me, I get questions about building ventilation ahead of a potential return to the office all the time. And so those questions, I think, will continue. The other one to say, I think there is a lot of data being gathered. The challenge is access, to go to Vit's point. There is sensitivity around some of this data from both the private sector and the public sector, often for good reasons. Like, this is sensitive data. It is data that can potentially be a cause of really significant public concern if it's not properly understood. And in the context we're in, I think there are sensitivities around that. But that being said, I am aware, for example, in the school space, of significant data gathering through both CO2 monitors and also some more detailed studies that have been done. So I think there are efforts, and obviously the Department of Health are doing have done over the last 2 years and continue to do a lot of kind of outbreak monitoring and assessment. But I'm not sure quite how we crack the nut around kind of access to data and freeing that up to enable researchers like Lydia and her colleagues, particularly in the academy, as well as industry, to kind of unpack it and see the trends and get the benefit of it. That's, I think, the hard one. You
mentioned earlier ESMs, essential service measures, as a part of a building. Access to those and their monitoring ought to be on a monthly basis for every strata title apartment in the country. It ought to be annual. When we sell buildings in Victoria, they go out with what we call a Section 32 statements, and they now include statements about whether the cladding is adequate or not. There ought to be statements included about the air quality in the buildings and reference to the minutes of the body's corporate and compliance with ESMs.
Can I just jump on that as well? I think more generally I would say access to building information, including real-time information, is kind of, in my view, the way of the future. Like, when I think about how are we going to regulate buildings in 20 years, one of what I hope is one of the key step changes we see is kind of radical transparency to building performance, because that will drive improved outcomes across all metrics, ESMs, air quality, amenity. And I think, we're on the cusp of, I think we've seen a lot of the technological change, and now we need to see the behavioural and regulatory change that always follows technological innovation to enable us to have that level of kind of radical transparency. And I think it'll start in the commercial sector, in office spaces and things like that, and then it will translate down into the residential sector. And I suspect that will be a game changer across building regulation.
I'd be quite interested to comment on this. We have, in the energy sector, as I go back to NABERS again, detailed information as to how that energy is assessed in every building, and that is essentially transparent, certainly to the certification system, and the government then gets a rating out of it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stars, knowing that there's a whole lot of data behind it to support that. There are thousands of buildings around the country, thousands, almost thousands of buildings around the country that have data on indoor environment. They have all the parameters. There's a dozen parameters that are in there, which are carbon dioxide, temperature, VOCs, etc., all part of it. There are some things we don't have because biological monitoring was dropped early in the version 1 of NABERS, but version 2 of NABERS is there, and it's a mature product, including the need for BMS data on a daily basis. The whole of the BMS data needs to report it back to NABERS to get yourself another star. So all that data is sitting there. It's not, but that is private from each building to neighbours. There might be, and I've spoken at conferences and appealed for this, international conferences as well, to unlock that data somehow under some sort of privacy arrangements. Can do it. Taxation department does it. We should be able to get that data in the interests of public health and use that for guidance of benchmarking and for the guidance of government. But that data, essentially we know what a good building is because we have the data. The thing is, because it's not unlocked and private to the certification bodies, and the same with internationally, all that massive amount of data is there, but it's not accessible. And it's getting that access to that data which will then inform researchers, will inform regulators, but most importantly, inform the operators, the Facility Management Association and the Property Council of Australia, who are very powerful for driving these changes. If you try to regulate and don't get those organisations on board, ERA, PCA, FMA, you're dead in the water. Absolutely dead in the water. It is not a one-to-one public issue. It is actually organisations voting with their money and their feet to get certified, put that badge on the front of their, a badge of pride on their front door. Westpac's a great example in terms of planetary, performance, if you like. The banks were vying to have the highest certification. If we do that with building safety, etc., and put all the legal things and the regulatory things as the punishment, if you like, the sticks behind it, I think we have Australia an absolutely unique scenario here at the moment. No one else in the world has this data. Neighbours IE and Neighbours Energy are world leading in terms of, and that's why whenever I go to a conference in the US, they quote Australia as being ahead of them. Even two buttons on the system. They don't have two buttons on the system for water saving anywhere else.
So, conscious of the time that we have left and the plethora of questions we still have to go through, and sorry, Lydia, that I'm going to move on and not let you chime into this conversation. Digitisation, powerful in transforming. We can see the behavioural changes and the legislative changes that are happening in New South Wales by way of comparison. I mean, not in this space, but where accountability and rating of buildings by reference to quality of workmanship and quality of design has become a reality. So there are, I always say, careful what we all wish for. It looks like change is on the horizon, and not just in New South Wales, but generally. But let me come back to some of these questions that I'm seeing, and one issue that I actually had on my list. There's an observation by an audience member that says there's little or no discussion on hygienically cleaning AC systems, both ducted and ductless, wondering why schools opt for air purifiers to clean the dirty air coming out of the AC systems. There's a plethora of questions also about the products that are out there. Do we need to also think about regulating products that are to be used or being used to deliver air quality? Is that part of the regulation piece as well?
Well, the first step is knowing whether you've got an air quality problem.
Of course.
And that's the stuff that Bit's referring to.
Having identified that.
Whether it's cheap and nasty $20 monitors, which are a bit of a trick rather than anything else, or whether it's something sophisticated which is covering a dozen measures. And again, I think Rob Adams will talk about that tomorrow. You've got to know to start with. And if there's bad air coming out of an air conditioning system, somebody's got to know it before they're going to do anything about it.
Knowledge is power, absolutely. But knowledge about what products to actually introduce into your environments to help the situation is also necessary. How do we deal with that, or do we not deal with that? Do we allow the market to deal with that? Do we leave that in the hands of manufacturers and suppliers to work out what's good for the environment?
It's absolutely necessary to standardize this. During the pandemic, I've seen potentially any possible and impossible solutions to technological solutions and different companies marketing something. And in some cases, one look at this was very clear that, well, if it was just not doing anything, all right, but it was doing dangerous things, generating something indoors, was a big problem. And the more problematic the device sometimes is, the more exciting it sounds, or the more exciting the manufacturers make it. And then I've heard, oh, wow, we are using this technology out of this world and will do these things. No, this technology will not. This technology will endanger you. So putting standards on this and regulations is absolutely critical.
So I think I don't disagree. I think the question is whether the solution is kind of specific or general. So the kind of specific solution would be relatively highly prescriptive regulations and standards of different classes of products. Now, the problem, I think the challenge there is that from a compliance and enforcement point of view, in a global supply chain, that's a really challenging kind of regulatory space. So the standards can be great, but if they're not effectively enforced, then they're not really worth the paper they're written on. The other approach is a more general one that essentially beefs up existing protections against, misleading and deceptive behaviours that exist under, Jeanette, you know this stuff better than I do, under the Trade Practices Act and the like, because I do worry that the prescriptive route is very kind of burdensome and slow and would, stand in the way of innovation potentially, and also just in the absence of a kind of cop on the beat, so to speak, it's hard to see how effective that's going to be. And the other thing, just from a building kind of performance point of view, is the individual products are one thing, and they need to be kind of operate as described and certainly meet minimum standards where those standards exist. But buildings are systems, right? And what we need is the system as a whole to perform as required. And so my sense is probably the fastest way home is through kind of performance standards in terms of building performance for whatever it is, whether that's indoor air quality or whatever, and then appropriate regulation of the manufacturers and the way in which manufacturers present their products. I think one of the challenges we have in this space is that often building products are not recognised as consumer products, and so we have quite effective consumer protections in Australia. So if you're selling a fridge or you're selling a TV and you say it performs in a way and it doesn't, the consumer has really strong remedies. If you're selling external wall cladding, as we know really well, that's not a consumer product, and so the consumer regulators aren't interested in that. I think that's a space where maybe there's a bit more work to be done that could yield some really good benefits.
May I ask Trevor a question?
Sure.
Trevor, Safe Work Australia says that personal air cleaners are one per person.
Yep.
How do you justify one air cleaner in a class of 30 kids?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you justify it in part by, I'm not sure that I can answer that question in detail because I'm not the technical expert, but
it's a very big air filter.
It is a large air filter, but I don't think it's feasible to have one air cleaner per student, and I don't know that anyone would say that that's actually required, despite what Safe Work Australia might say. So, yeah, I'm not sure how I can answer that question. To be honest.
But I'm interested in the process as to. I saw the political imperative of doing something.
Yep.
We're assessing a lot of schools.
Yep.
As soon as you open the window, that personal air cleaner itself is just swamped by external air influences, depending on the wind. But then in a regulatory sense, you've got a major national body which says, and look, any HVAC person will tell you the volumes driven through these things and where this air circulates is its own personal environment, is not a substitute for HVAC.
Correct.
So I understand that putting one air cleaner in a classroom has been a good political move, but in terms of thinking that the classroom is now safe is the most dangerous thing.
I agree with that, and in actual fact, and this isn't. I should note that just for transparency, the Department of Education has led that work, and so I'm speaking a little bit out of school here, but it's not the case that there is HEPA filter units in every classroom. In fact, what's been done is an assessment of classrooms to understand what can be done to optimise ventilation, including the majority of classrooms are naturally ventilated, so in most cases it's about what can be done to generate cross ventilation and improve the air change rate. HEPA units have been used where it's been judged that that's not sufficient to bolster the protection for students. So I don't think it's been a one-size-fits-all approach across schools. And the other thing to note is, no one's saying that putting a HEPA filter in a room makes it safe, and in fact that's why I believe as of Monday, grade 3 to 6 students still need to wear masks, because vaccination rates are low in that cohort. We acknowledge that despite the interventions we make, there are still risks, and so the use of masks is an additional prevention. And other behavioural changes through the education system, such as greater use of outside learning, eating meals outside, so on and so forth, have been mandated. So I think the approach has tried to be more nuanced than that, maximise the ventilation, whether that's HVAC or natural ventilation, optimise it for air changes, and then where that doesn't get you far enough and there's a case to be made for the use of HEPA units, and the animation I had in my presentation tried to demonstrate the way in which they are effective at least significantly removing the problematic particles from the air much more effectively than natural ventilation alone, that they are rolled out. So that's the approach.
So I have to interject because we are out of time, but I think there is an important analogy here to be made with combustible cladding, and that is that the starting point for this issue and for regulation is that there is no such thing as zero risk. There just isn't. And it would be fanciful for the education to suggest that that's achievable. Even when we talk about achieving safety, that word can mean so many different things in so many different contexts. So reducing risk is what the focus is at the moment. Getting to a place where we can manage the risk in a consistent way is the ideal. But I think we need to leave room for the possibility that not every solution is going to be perfect for every circumstance. That sounds like I'm backing you, Trevor. But I say that because we have to remember that this is not about zero risk. Like fire, we'll never get zero risk. Out of time, let's end on a positive. Can I ask each of you if there was one thing that each of us could go away and focus on today to the end that there be better regulation in this space, what do you think that could be? Lydia, can I start with you?
Well, I made notes here, and one of them was to get in touch with you and to write a joint paper bringing indoor air quality and the legal aspects of this. So that's action for me.
Thank you. I look forward to that challenge. Vit?
Well, I think it's transparent. Use the tools and the information that we already have and supplement them with ongoing risk management approaches to make sure that it's effective and continuing and progressive. It doesn't have to be immediate, but using the Pareto principle, pick the most critical, might be education, something like that, and make sure that those lessons are translated into the other space.
Trevor?
So I think it's around the collective effort that's required from government, industry, academia, around the education piece, like really selling the message around why building ventilation and why indoor air quality matter. And I think that's what's going to generate change ultimately, the community understanding why this happened. And you're right, I hope we don't have to wait for a crisis the way we did with combustible cladding. But I think collectively we can kind of sell that message.
And Ted?
Bipartisan National Task Force ASAP. There's no politics in this. This is an intractable problem. If you're in opposition, be careful what you wish for. This will be around for a while. It'll be your responsibility one day. There's no politics in it. We need everybody to focus on this nationally in a bipartisan way. The sooner the better.
And from my part, the takeaway is that whilst we wait for regulation, governments, industry, there's actually something each of us can do right now. And the sum total of that will mean a reduction of risk to some extent. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Lydia, for joining us from afar. Back to you, Ben.
Thank you, Jeanette, for handling such a rich discussion with such skill. And can I just say that we were getting absolutely peppered with questions, which obviously we couldn't possibly meet them all. The good news is for all of all of you out there who are sending questions through, as we've got another day and a half of industry experts that you can pose those questions to. Can I just say a sincere thank you to all of you for participating today. You've been generous with your time this morning and in the lead up to. The takeaway for me is it was such a rich discussion that I need to go back and watch it again. And for all of you watching out there, obviously we've notified you previously that all of this is being recorded and we'll make it available to you post-event, so you can go back and watch it too.
We would like to thank our event partners for supporting the Building Ventilation Summit.